Hello everybody, and today we are doing my July wrap-up. So a lot of my July wrap-up will be slightly overlapping with like my vlogs that I did throughout the month of July, but everything will be in one place over here. Plus, the further we got along into the month of July, the less like consistently I was vlogging, and the more I feel like I was just like slacking when it came to vlogging and like not remembering like what I'd already talked about in my vlogs and what I hadn't. So I feel like especially towards the latter half of July, my vlogs are just not reliable sources of what I read this month and how I felt about them. I will say that how much further along we get into the month, or like how much further along we get away from today, that doesn't make sense at all. The more we go back in time, the less active my memories will be of these books, and some of these books I really don't have much of a memory of at all, which I guess also says something about the books, I guess. But maybe not necessarily, I just really have a shitty memory when it comes to these things. So let's just go through them. So I'm gonna take my notes here to see what I read, because I didn't only read physical, so some of the things that I read will have been in ebook form or audiobook form, and so I don't want to forget about them. So the first thing that I finished in the month of July is something that carried over from June that I wasn't able to finish, and that is The Oleander Sword by Tasha Suri. And this is one of those examples of I have barely any memory of this book at all at this point in time. My main recollection about this book is that it was disappointing. Like, I did not have a full success story with book one in this series. So this is a series in which we're following mainly two girls. One of them is sort of like the princess of let's say the empire, the overruling empire, and she is kind of like, there's this sort of like mythology here that if she were to sacrifice herself and like let her be burned alive, then that will like result in a lot of power for the realm. However, she refuses. As a consequence, she's kind of sent off to this sub-region of the empire to kind of be locked there in a tower, and that's where she meets our other protagonist, who is a girl who with a secret. And most of the story is about uncovering those secrets partly, but also it's about like the push and pull between these two. There's a sort of like innate attraction between the two of them. However, I didn't really like the first one all that much because I felt like it was very stagnant, but I thought that the plot of the first one specifically led to that sort of like dislike, and I was thinking like, okay, if we go into book two, well, I'll still have sort of like the world building that I do enjoy about book one, but there will be more like movements within the plot. However, with book two, I feel like part of my problem with it is the amount of POVs. There are a ton of POVs, and some of them are just in there just for one chapter, just so that you can have some information about what happens firsthand rather than it being told through exposition later on. But actually this book tells me that I prefer to have it in exposition. I prefer to have somebody like relate later on that, you know, like this or that battle happened somewhere, or you know, like this small instigating factor to an event. I don't want it reported in person. If we are going to get it from a POV, that doesn't matter at all. And aside from that, I just felt like we were too quickly back to the sort of like same deal as we had been in book one. Like, it too quickly became about the interaction between these two characters again, whereas I thought like the circumstances of the ending of the book one could lead to more interesting plot points within book two, and that just ended up not being the case. So I am DNFing this series. It's not like I had a horrible time with them, but definitely book two I was just struggling with because of the fact that I like hoped for it to finally be that hook into the series, and it turned out not to be. Next up, I finished the first book that I started for Game Night at Dawn, because I haven't actually mentioned this, but this is also the month of Game Night at Dawn, which is my own readathon in which we play sort of like board game with books. And for this readathon, I needed to read a book that had an evil protagonist in order to count the star prompt, and I read American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, I think is the name, and this was a horrible time. And I really, in hindsight, think I should have just like found another book for the first 3 spaces there and just like counted the first 100 pages of American Psycho for that one space that I needed as prompts for, because I put myself through all 400 pages of this book for what? For nothing. So American Psycho is a book in which we're following a guy who's basically at the top of his career. I think he works in the financial career, I've already forgotten that, or he's a lawyer or something like that, but in actuality he's basically sort of like serial killer, though there's some like debate about whether it's all in his head or something like that. But basically the book is just filled with snobbery and horrible acts. Like, he is constantly name dropping brands and stuff like that because, you know, image is all that important to him and he's like really invested in those types of things. And then aside from that, he's constantly doing cruel things or thinking of doing cruel things to particularly like homeless people. He has something against the homeless for some reason, and women. And so it was just vile, and I didn't really see the point of it, you know, except for shock value. And yeah, so I put myself through all of those 400 pages, and at the end I was just like, why? What is the point of all of this? Because I was hoping, like, I don't mind it being like shock value, horrible, disgusting, if there is a point to it. Like, let's take as a comparison, let's take 10 Rings of Flesh, which also has very horrible acts within it, but that book is saying something about the way in which we treat animals at this point in time, for example, and there's a lot more to that book that I could go into, but it is saying something. What is this saying? What is American Psycho saying? Is it saying something about, I don't know, the callousness that we might be moving into, the callousness of, you know, like people at the top of these type of careers that are all about gain and profit, potentially, but then it's just all down to the reader to see that in it, because there is nothing within this book that questions anything, or nothing within this book that like indicates that this is why it is there. It is just a book about horrible things that doesn't even give you a sense of whether these horrible things are happening, which then also ends with like, are they even happening or not? And like, yeah, I didn't get along with it. That's my conclusion here. I didn't think it was worthwhile at all. Next up, I finished a comic book collection, which is Alone in Space by Tilly Walden. And this is a sort of like mixed bag. I feel like the first section of this is a rather long story called The End of Summer, which is like the first 78 pages of this like 300 page collection. And I had problems with that first one, with understanding what was happening, with distinguishing between the different art styles for the different characters. I didn't really fully grasp like who was the, like, at times I was like, wait, is this that same person as we saw in that scene, or is this another person? And so I had problems with that first one in particular, and all the rest are such short things that, you know, I liked some of them definitely, but like nothing in here like completely convinced me. But she does have another story that I think was not in here, right? I think it's called On a Sunbeam, which I might still be interested in because I did like the style in some of the cartoons within this collection. So I might be interested in like maybe borrowing that from the library one day or something like that. But in all, I'm just like left not really knowing what my thoughts are about this, so basically being like disappointed in it. So a good start to this month, clearly. Then we finally hit upon one that is a success, though not as much of a success as I would have loved to, and that is The Labyrinth's Heart by M.A. Carrick. And the problem with that is just that I loved book 2 so much that my expectations for book 3 were just like through the roof. Like, book 2 is like 5-star read, one of my favorites of all times, and with The Labyrinth's Heart, I don't know, there's just something not fully there. It doesn't... like, it didn't have that, oh my god, my heart is fully invested in this now, oh my god, I love how this ended, oh my god, I'm obsessed with this now feeling that I had with book 2, and so as a consequence it's going to be a little bit of a disappointment. But this entire series is very, very good. I would like to reread it at one point when I've taken a little bit more time away from it, and then maybe my thoughts about book 3 will also kind of change, because I'll go into it with a lower expectation than I did this time around. But so the Rook and Rose series is a series in which we're looking at this world which is like Venetian inspired. It has a character called Ren, who is basically, when she was young, she was part of this sort of like criminal gang, like this woman who was like controlling this group of kids to do the dirty works for her. Don't know whether this is still the exact same frame as it was before, and this chair has been in frame all the time, but camera, like the battery went out, so I had to restart the clip. So, and so Ren ends up having to flee with her sister from this group of criminals and has to flee the city. However, 10 years later or something like that, not entirely sure how many years later, she decides to come back and try to con her way into a wealthy family in order to steal their money, not realizing that they are actually broke. I really enjoyed this one. I think this is super wholesome, has such great character dynamics, and that is at the heart of this entire series, is the love for characters and for their interactions and for their bonds and the communication between them as well. I think this is the type of book that also shows that you can write a story in which the characters are open with one another. They aren't always open with one another, especially book 1. There's still a lot of like sticking to oneself, distrust and things like that, but throughout the series there is more trust growing between certain characters, and you see some more open communication taking place, and communication that you can kind of feel like, if you've read a whole ton of fantasy, for example, there are moments in this where you feel the way that a lot of books would have gone. You feel like, oh yeah, now she's gonna distrust this person, so she's gonna keep this information to herself, and as a consequence a lot is going to go wrong. Whereas in this one they don't do that. In this one a different route is chosen, and so this book kind of shows that you can have clear communication between characters and still have a engrossing plot, that, you know, miscommunication doesn't have to be like the instigator of all types of plots and twists, things like that. So I do really enjoy this series, let that be clear. It's just that I was going into book 3 with so many expectations because I absolutely love book 2, and so I guess it's kind of its own downfall as a consequence because of how much I love book 2 and going straight into book 3 almost. Next up, we finish what will have been my favorite read of the month, and that is Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wong. So M.L. Wong is the author of Sword of Kaigen, which is also a 5-star read, so M.L. Wong is 2 for 2 for me in this instance, and so this is very different from the Sword of Kaigen, I would definitely say. The only sort of like real thing that they have in common is the fact that they have a female protagonist, and in this one we have a female scholar who is living in a very misogynist society. She is basically the first woman sort of like magician who has made it into the upper ranks of the magic academy basically, and from day one she kind of has to deal with a lot of misogynistic treatment because of that, but at the same time she herself is perpetrating a lot of racist views, because she kind of gets thrust into the path of a assistant to her who is a, I don't actually remember the name of their society, so he's part of a sort of like different culture that is very much looked down upon within this society. They are people who are coming from outside of the city, trying to make it into the city, and when they get to the city they live like a lower class life because they are relegated to these low-paying jobs, and they are very much looked down upon by everybody else. And so she also perpetrates these same sort of like views. She is very much looking down upon him, and while she treats him better than other people within this world do, by listening to him and, you know, like changing her mind about him and in society, she still very frequently will say these harmful things that have to do with the way that she has been made to see them. And so I love this book tackling both the misogyny and the racism, and showing that somebody who is in a minority position doesn't always like get a free pass on things, you know, like the fact that she is very much like being looked down upon for being a woman doesn't mean that she herself cannot have wrong views about other people, that she herself doesn't fall into the same traps of having prejudiced views about people without actually really knowing these people. And so in this And a lot of this, and what this book also really does that I always love when a book does, is kind of like reevaluating what has been told to you, reevaluating accepted truths, and so this book will definitely be doing that. This book also very much, and yeah, I cannot really say much more, I feel like, without potentially like spoiling some things, but yeah, I really enjoyed it a whole ton, and I wish more people will read it. I know that ML Wang has had quite some splash with the Sword of Kaigen, and in recent years that book has definitely gained more notoriety, more fame. I've also only read it in recent years, and so I'm hoping that this book will also just gain more and more readership throughout time, and that more and more people will start to explore it, because I feel like this one really is an amazing read. Next up we have a DNF, and it is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I will say that I read it in the Dutch translation, and I absolutely feel like the Dutch translation was horrible, so I cannot really speak to the fact of like Sarah J. Maas's writing perhaps, but I do have it on account that that first book apparently is very poorly written as well, that apparently she wrote it when she was very young and when she didn't have like an editor yet, and so that's like later books have a much better writing style because they've also passed through an editor and things like that, and because of course she matured as an author. But this first book was really bad in my opinion, and it isn't necessarily even the writing. Like the writing very much annoyed me, of course, but I could get over it. But the problem that I definitely have with it is just like I couldn't suspend my disbelief here, because this is about a female character who supposedly is like the best assassin in the kingdom, and she's been like rotting away in some sort of a prison for a long time, and now like the prince of the realm kind of like releases her from prison so that she can take part in this sort of like trial type thingy in order to have him win those. So the whole premise is that she's supposed to be like the best assassin in the kingdom. However, she does stupid stuff all the time, and I'm not talking about the fact that, you know, she no longer has conditioning because of the fact of having been stuck away in this prison for like at least a year, but like just her decision making is just like stupid, and she's very like cocky and arrogant and very much feels like, you know, like she's the best assassin, so everybody else is beneath her. But I feel like a really good assassin would actually strategically be like trying to play the underdog, and she is like constantly arrogant about like needing to prove that she's the best, but then also like doing really poorly at certain stuff that makes you go like, but if you really were like the best assassin in the world, then like why are you doing these things, or why is this your reasoning? And like I just couldn't get behind that concept that she was the best assassin that there was, whereas her actions just made it seem like she was not a good assassin after all. So I read 200 pages for that in order to count it for Game Marathon, and then I was like, thank God that I can stop with that. Next up, I finished another series, and that is the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams, by reading the Poison Song to the final book in this. The Winnowing Flame trilogy, I find it always a little bit difficult to give its premise, so we're basically looking at this world that has, let's say, like mainly two societies in it. There are more, but like you have the Aborans, who's basically this sort of like elite race that had been kind of like the protectors and the elite forces within the world. They worship this sort of like tree god who is now withered and seems to be close to dying, and in the past the Aborans could eat from the fruit of the tree. However, the tree is no longer giving fruit, and so they feed off of human beings. However, the more they feed off of them, the more likely they are to incur a certain disease that will end up killing them. And then you also have, of course, the humans, who are now much more prominent as Aborn society is kind of slipped into oblivion. And within this human world, there's also this sort of like cult that is taking women who manifest certain powers and kind of like punishing them to keep them down. And we kind of follow three characters spread out across these three realities. We follow an Aborn who's kind of like in a somewhat depressed state over the downfall of his society. We follow a human scholar who is trying to find out as much as she can about Aborns, but also about this ancient enemy that keeps on recurring, that has been slumbering for a while now, but that she isn't really fully convinced that they won't be coming back. And then we follow a girl who is part of this like cult who is being kept in a restrictive circumstances. This is a bad job that I'm doing at selling this plot, but I did really enjoy this series. It is not an all-time favorite for me, and I cannot pinpoint why. I enjoyed this series, but I never loved this series, and yeah, that is a problem, that I cannot figure out what the deal is. What about this didn't fully work for me? But I'm guessing it comes down to characters probably. I probably was just like not invested enough in these characters, because I can tell you that like at the end of the day I don't really have many characters here that I really cared about, or that like I would want to see their plot go in a certain direction or another. Initially I had that with like the girl in the restricted society, but in the end I still don't feel like I have much of an attachment to her, and characters are always kind of like my way into like my way into loving a book, the way that I end up being like, okay, this is a favorite series, something that I will devour, is because I have an attachment to the characters, and I didn't end up having that here. However, why didn't I end up having that here? That I cannot tell you, and that I cannot pinpoint for myself. But so I think it is definitely a solid series. It is an interesting series as well when it comes to that thing that I told you guys earlier, which is re-examining known truths. So this book definitely will break down some of the truths that have always been accepted. It is a good series for people who it also has an interesting mix between sort of like fantasy and sci-fi elements. It has perspectives from both sides of the story, let's say it like that. There are perspectives that we are following from the good guys and perspectives that we are following from the bad guys. It has like talking companions from a certain point within this series. So there definitely are good elements to this, and I'm definitely not saying that it's not a good series. I gave them all 4 stars, for example, but it just didn't have that magic elements to make me go like, ah, love this. Next up, I read and finished another graphic novel, which is The Fox Maidens by Robin Ha. This plays with the mythology of the nine-tailed fox, which I don't know much about, so I really don't know how well it does this or not. This is a story about 2 girls, so we're mainly following one of them, and that one is like the daughter of a sort of like hero within the society who is said to have killed the nine-tailed fox. And so she is his daughter and learns martial arts alongside him, which also kind of puts her in a like bad position compared to people around her, the people in this society who don't view that as her rightful place. So she's kind of battling a misogynist society like that as well. And there's stuff that I'm not going to talk about because I don't really remember how far into the story these things start to happen, so whether they might be spoilers as well. I thought this one was nice, I enjoyed it. It's definitely one of the more like success stories of the month, but it's also one that I don't think is gonna stick with me, but I did enjoy it, and I did also like the art style of this, and it has like very colorful patterns, colorful palette as well, even though a lot of it is like in sepia as well. It would actually be interesting, I guess, to look at like what is in sepia and what then ends up being in like full color and the decision making there. But yeah, I did enjoy this one and would recommend it, but it's also not one that I'm gonna like treasure forever, let's say it like that. And then the final thing that I finished within the month of July is The Sunlit Man by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 4th and final of the secret projects that came out last year, but I have heard it through the grapevine that there was another secret project, I think, but I haven't really been keeping track of Brandon Sanderson's announcements anymore. But my problem here is going to be the multiverse, let's say it like that. I have problems when worlds become too big. I have this with the MCU, for example. I have completely like stopped trying to keep up with the MCU now because there's just too much out there. And while I knew, not from the get-go, but for a long time already, of course, that the Cosmere is all these stories that are linked together, that they part in the same world, I end up not enjoying the more recent installments in it, because the original installments, the first books that are out there from the Cosmere, are very much isolated, and even though they have these elements here or there that we know or that we see reoccurring and that we know through Brandon Sanderson, the links to one another, they are very much isolated. You don't need knowledge of the other worlds to be able to enjoy those books. But the further along we get into the Cosmere, the more that there are these connections, the more that there is a need to read everything in order for you to enjoy things. Because this novella is a case in point, I guess, to some extent, because this is a character who is coming from a certain world who is now in another world, and there are elements here from other worlds yet. And so the whole sort of like interconnected Cosmere, that aspect is becoming unenjoyable to me. And so The Sunlit Man, it was a fine book, it was okay, it didn't do much for me, I will say. I definitely also struggled a little bit with getting into it, the way that it was like the voice of the main character from the beginning didn't really like click with me. I found the voice of the main character to be quite annoying for the first like third half of it or something like that. I did end up getting to enjoy that voice more towards the end of the story, but yeah, there is just that aspect to it that is becoming not enjoyable to me, and that is totally down to personal taste, you know. I don't like these types of dynamics within in between different books. And I guess when I saw the Cosmere as like one interconnected universe, I always just imagined it being like more low-key, the way that the interconnections were going to happen, and it's just becoming so prominent that it is slightly impacting, or it is impacting. It's not slightly anymore at this point in time. It was slightly at some point, and it's becoming majorly impacting my enjoyment of these books. And I have read it all. I will say that I haven't devoured all of Brandon Sanderson's like explanations and stuff like that, so a lot of the mechanics in this Cosmere are also not as clear to me as they might be to other people who are following all of his content and all of his updates. But that's my main problem with it, is you have to keep up with so much in order to fully get everything out of this. And yes, you can make the case for the fact that you can enjoy these stories separately without having had any of the other prior knowledge, but I feel like at this point in time they are written to be enjoyed with all of that info. And you know, that just doesn't work for me. That's just not what I enjoy. So I am hoping that to some extent we can continue doing this to some extent, you know, but I am hoping that there will also be books that are going to come out within the Cosmere, that within this stage of the Cosmere, that don't do that. Like, you can have your book with your interconnections where you have a character from one planet move to another planet, be exposed to technology from yet another planet, talk about even another planet and stuff like that. But I would like for some books as well to be there that will have none of those elements at this point in time. And I think that that would still work for me. The problem that I'm having now is that it's starting to feel like they should all have those. And maybe I'm contradicting myself here as well, because I'm not entirely sure actually whether the third secret project had any interconnections. Probably not, and probably that is why I enjoy the third one the most of all of them. The third one is the one that I really enjoyed, and probably for that reason, because at this point in time I cannot think of whether it had much interconnection to the rest of the Cosmere, potentially. Was it even Cosmere 1? Which is another good question, but so yeah, that is starting to impede my enjoyment of it. I like the Cosmere in the sense that I like the magics that result from the Cosmere, but I don't like this current trend of them all interconnecting. So yeah, that's my conclusion here. So I did start a few other things that I didn't end up completing within this month, and I will probably talk about another one which I actually don't know where it is currently, and that is Phantom Folk by Eliza Chan, because I have in August decided that I'm just going to soft DNF it because I am not getting along with it that well, but I also don't know whether it's just the audiobook that I'm not getting along with, whether it really is the story or not, but I've decided that I'm going to take a step back from it, and at a later point in time I'm going to try and get back into it, going to try to read it physically. But at this point in time, because I tried to start the audiobook again a few times, I've listened to like sections of this for many times at this point in time, and so I felt like, okay, for me to really give this one a fair second chance, I feel like I have to take a break from it first and then come back to it at a later point in time, trying to see then whether it is really the story that's just really not like clicking with me, that's really not like appealing to me, or whether it was just that audiobook that, you know, I for some reason or another couldn't pay attention to. So just wanted to mention that because I'm not going to be mentioning it in my August TBR, August wrap up, because, you know, I haven't read a single page in it within August. I just in August decided, like, you know what, let's not force myself to make a decision on this right now. Let's just soft DNF it. But so yeah. That means, and I didn't even say it at the beginning, I don't know at what amount of books that I started, but it will have been in the edited version of this. And I also don't remember at what point I ended. I think I ended with 15 books, and I think I started with 16, so there's not much of a diminishment there. And if I would have filmed this at like the 1st of August, I could have told you that my plan was to majorly focus on my physical TBR within the month of August, but it is the 11th of August and I've yet to read a single book off of my physical TBR. I've only DNF'd a book that I started within August, but I did read some pages of it in August, so I will be talking about that one within my August wrap up after all. But so yeah, it's not looking good for the TBR Zero project in that sense. I have a book on the way. There's another book being published in a few days that I pre-ordered. So yeah, there's another book in August that I pre-ordered that will also be heading my way, right? So yeah, I will be happy if I keep the status quo in August, I guess, and then September will be Magical Readathon. So let's see if we can make it by the end of the year. Let's see if we can get that Project Zero TBR by the end of the year, and let's remind myself that I just spontaneously decided to go for TBR Zero at some point throughout this year, but that was not my intention at the beginning of the year, and so if it doesn't end up happening, then that is also just fine. But so yeah, let me know what the best book was that you read in the month of August. Let me know what book on my wrap up here interests you the most, and see you guys for the next video. Bye!